A waitress with a broken leg, a crime lord with a gun, and the one word she said that changed everything. Lena Hayes had nothing, no money, no future, no way out. Victor Kane had everything: power, fear, and a city at his feet. When he walked into her diner to collect a debt, she told him to order something or leave. That single act of defiance didn't get her killed. It made him obsessed. What followed was surgeries, safe houses, secrets, and a truth so devastating it should have destroyed them both. Stay with us, because this story will change the way you see strength. Here on this channel, we bring you stories of powerful men, impossible love, and the unbreakable bonds of family told in ways that will stay with you long after the last word. This story reminds us that real power isn't the ability to destroy, it's the courage to choose someone even when it costs you everything. If the story moves you, hit like, drop a comment below telling us what you think Lena should have done, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you never miss a story that matters.
I still remember the buzz of that fluorescent light, the one that had been flickering for 3 weeks straight. It cast a sick, yellow glow on everything the night it all went wrong. From behind the grill, I'd watched Lena Hayes limp through her shift, the drag of her left leg more pronounced than usual. I knew Sal, my boss, was in trouble, but I kept my head down, flipping burgers like I had for 15 years. I was a fixture, part of the scenery, and that's how I stayed safe. But watching her, seeing the exhaustion on her face, a knot of guilt I'd been ignoring tightened in my gut. I told myself it wasn't my business. I was wrong. That night, she took a broken body and a weary spirit and threw them in the path of the city's most dangerous man. She collapsed at his feet, whispering, "I can't run." And in that moment, something in his world broke too. My silence had been a weapon against her, against all of us. And now, recalling that night, I finally understand. If you want to know how a small act of courage can change everything, stick around, drop a like, and comment with your city so I can see how far this story of quiet bravery goes. I saw Lena watching Sal's office door. He'd been locked in there for over an hour, and we both knew what that meant. Bad phone calls, the kind that made his hands tremble when he poured coffee. She came over to the grill, her voice a low murmur under the sizzle of the patties. "Did you hear what it's about?" I couldn't meet her eyes. I just mumbled, "Money, what else?" and went back to my work, a coward hiding behind a wall of smoke. The late-night crowd was thin, just the usual ghosts. Old Joe nursing his sugared-up coffee, a trucker named Dale working his way through a slice of pie, and Emma, the new girl, 19, and full of a nervous energy that reminded me of someone I used to be. She was over by Lena, her young face etched with worry. "You're limping worse than usual," she said, her voice soft. "Maybe you should sit." Lena just shook her head, that stubborn pride of hers on full display. That's when the front door swung open and the cold rolled in with them. 3 of them, all in suits that cost more than my car. They didn't walk in so much as occupy the space. Predators. I knew the type. My hands froze over the grill. The one in charge, he looked like he belonged on a magazine cover, all sharp angles and ice blue eyes. He scanned the diner like it was something he'd scraped off his shoe. "We're here to see Sal," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a sledgehammer. Emma, bless her heart, went pale and started toward the back office. But Lena stopped her, a firm hand on her wrist. "I'll handle it," she said. I watched her limp toward that door, every uneven step a testament to a fight she'd already survived, and I felt a fresh wave of shame. I should have been the one. I could hear Sal's panicked voice through the cheap wood. "I just need one more week. I swear I can get it." Then Lena knocked, and the whole world seemed to go silent. When Sal told her to ask for 5 minutes, I saw his face through the crack in the door. He looked like a dead man walking. Lena came back out, her shoulders set, and relayed the message. The leader just looked at his watch, a Rolex, of course. "Time's up," he said. And when Lena tried to reason with him, he cut her off, his voice dripping with condescension. "Go back to pouring coffee and let the adults handle business." That was it. I saw something shift in Lena's eyes. It was a quiet fire, but it burned hot. She'd taken abuse from life, from her own body, for years, but she wasn't going to take it from him. "This is a diner," she said, her voice shaking but strong. "Either order something or leave." The silence that fell was heavy enough to crack the floor tiles. The leader just stared at her, a flicker of something, surprise, maybe even respect, in his cold eyes. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lena," she said. He tasted the name, then smiled that razor-sharp smile of his. "My name," he said, letting each word land like a punch, "is Victor Kane." The name sucked the air right out of the room. I'd heard the whispers, the stories you tell in low voices. Victor Kane wasn't just a man. He was a boogeyman in a $5,000 suit. And Arlena, with her bad leg and a coffee pot in her hand, had just told him to get lost. "I see you've heard of me," Victor said, enjoying the fear he created. "Here's what's going to happen. Sal is going to come out and pay me the $50,000 he owes me, and we're all going to go about our evening. 50 grand. The number hung in the air, impossible and absolute. "And if he doesn't have it?" Lena asked, her voice barely a whisper. Victor's smile widened. "Then things get messy." Sal stumbled out of the office, a ghost of the man I knew. He begged. I'd worked for him for 15 years and I'd never seen him so completely broken. "Mr. Kane, I just need 2 more weeks." But Kane was a statue. "Not my problem," he said, his voice flat and empty of any pity. Sal offered him the 30,000 in the safe, a last desperate gamble. "Your life," Kane mused, as if considering it. Then, so smooth I almost didn't see it happen, there was a gun in his hand. It wasn't pointed at anyone, but it might as well have been pointed at all of us. Emma let out a little sob. "Here's my counteroffer," Victor said, his gaze drifting past Sal, past Lena, and landing right on 19-year-old Emma. And in that moment, something inside me snapped. Years of looking away, of staying quiet, it all burned up in a flash of hot rage. My hand closed around the handle of a heavy cast-iron skillet on the stove. It was time to make some noise. It's been months, but I still see that night every time I close my eyes. The moment he walked in, the whole diner went quiet. Victor Kane. You don't live around here without knowing that name. He wasn't after the money in the register, he was after Sal. And when Sal couldn't pay, his eyes landed on Emma. My blood ran cold. He said he'd take her, called her an asset, like she was a thing to be sold. I was frozen behind the counter, my feet glued to the floor. But then Lena moved. I remember thinking, what is she doing? She could barely get through a shift without her leg giving out. But she put herself right in his path, this tiny, broken woman against a monster. "You'll have to go through me first," she'd said, and I swear the whole world stopped breathing. All I could feel was the shame burning in my gut, because she was doing what I was too terrified to even consider. For a few seconds there was just silence. Then he laughed, a sound that made my skin crawl. He knew he'd already won. "Lena, don't," I heard Sal whisper. But it was too late. I saw Kane look her over, from her shaking hands to her busted leg. He knew she was bluffing, that she was running on nothing but nerve. "What are you gonna do?" he'd asked her, and the honest answer was nothing. She couldn't do a thing. But she said, "Whatever it takes." He was so close to her then, I could see him sizing her up, taking in every detail of the woman who had dared to defy him. He didn't even flinch. His hand shot out and grabbed her arm, not with violence, but with a terrifying sort of control that showed her it was already over. Then he just pulled. Her bad leg buckled, just like it always did when she moved too fast. The sound of her hitting that dirty floor is something I'll never forget. Pain flashed across her face, and there she was, crumpled at his feet. I felt sick. I should have done something, anything, but I was just another coward watching from the sidelines. She looked up at him, all the fight gone, replaced by a desperation that was heartbreaking to see. Please, she begged him. I can't fight. I can't run. But don't take her. She talked about Emma's little brother, about her trying to get to community college. She laid out this whole girl's life for him, right there on the grimy linoleum. The only sounds were the buzz of the overhead lights and Emma crying behind the counter. He just stared down at her, his face a complete blank. Then he asked about her leg. It was the last thing I ever expected to hear. She told him about the car crash 4 years ago. He seemed to notice for the first time that she worked on her feet every single night, despite the pain. I don't have a choice, she'd told him. He said everyone has choices, but his voice was different. Softer. I saw it then, a flicker of something human in his eyes. He asked why she didn't just stay quiet, why she'd protected Emma. Because she reminds me of who I used to be, Lena had whispered, her voice raw. Because nobody helped me. I won't let that happen to someone else. He knelt down, getting on her level. For the first time, I saw that his eyes weren't cold, just empty, like he'd buried anything good a long time ago. He asked for her name again, Lena Hayes, and repeated it slow, like he was memorizing it. He asked how long she'd worked for us, 3 years, and if she had family. No, just me now. The words hung in the air. Then he stood up and told Sal to open the safe. Sal was shaking so bad he dropped the cash, bills scattering everywhere. About $30,000, all our earnings. But Kane didn't take it. He made a call, and one of his guys walked in with a briefcase full of more money than I've ever seen. Clean, crisp, $100 bills. He ordered his man to count out 50,000 and put it in our safe. We all just stood there, stunned into silence. Nobody knew what to do. Count it out, he said again, and this time his voice was pure steel. I watched as his guy stacked bundle after bundle of cash into our rusty old safe. The sound was unreal. When it was done, Kane looked at Sal. Your debt is paid. In full. Even the interest. Sal couldn't even speak. Emma just whispered, "What is this?" "A gift," Kane said, but he was looking at Lena, still on the floor. From the girl who can't run, but stood anyway. Then he and his men were gone, the bell on the door chiming like it was any other night. The quiet they left behind was louder than the threats. I was the first one to move, rushing over to help Lena up. I kept asking if she was okay, if he'd hurt her. "My leg hurts," she said, but she was alive. Sal just sat there, staring at the money, while Emma hugged Lena, sobbing about how she'd saved her life. "I didn't do anything," Lena kept saying, but she was wrong. She did everything. Nobody stands up to Victor Kane. The story was all over the neighborhood by morning. People came in just to look at her, the waitress who faced down a monster and won. I was wiping down a table when I went over to her. "You need to be careful," I told her, my voice low. "Men like that, there's always a price." She said he called it a gift, but I knew better. Nothing in his world is free. I begged her to be careful, because I had a sick feeling this was far from over. Sure enough, 3 days later, a guy in a suit who screamed money walked in. He ordered a coffee and waited for things to quiet down before he cornered Lena. "My name is James Carter," he said. "I work for Mr. Kane." My stomach dropped. I tried to act busy, but I was listening to every word. He was offering her an opportunity. I watched her face, the way she stiffened. She knew it was a trap. Every part of me wanted to yell at her to run, to tell this guy to get lost, to finally do something. But the same old fear kept me quiet. She was about to say no, I could see it in her eyes. She was terrified, and she had every right to be. This was the price I warned her about. Her shift ended, and I saw her getting her things, her face pale. She was going to walk away from it, I was sure of it. But then I thought about her limping through another double, about the pain she never talked about. And I thought about me, standing there doing nothing while she put her life on the line. The guilt was suffocating. She deserved better, She deserves someone to stand up for her just once. So I finally moved. A terrifying sight. She took a seat. The man, James, slid a business card across the table. It was thick, with raised letters, the type that whispered wealth. He mentioned Mr. Kane was impressed by her actions the other night, admiring her bravery and her defense of a near stranger. He expressed a desire to assist her. In what way? By offering a life without the constant ache in her leg. The words landed like a punch to the gut. Lena's hand moved instinctively to her bad leg, concealed by her work pants. She dismissed it as impossible, mentioning specialists had called the damage permanent. James clarified she had only seen the doctors her insurance permitted, the ones who merely patch you up. He leaned in, explaining that Mr. Kane could provide the nation's top surgeons, advanced treatments, and effective physical therapy. He promised to handle every cost, from the surgery to recovery and medicine. Her question was sharp. Why would he offer all that? His answer was simple, because he could, and he chose to. She countered that no one does that for nothing. James agreed without hesitation. In return, Mr. Kane requested her time, for dinner once a week, just for conversation. Lena was incredulous. Just dinner? That's all. She didn't buy it. He acknowledged her doubt, saying he'd be skeptical too. He produced another card, this one for a Dr. Sarah Chen, a leading orthopedic surgeon. He told her an appointment was set for 10 a.m. the next day for a consultation. He urged her to hear the doctor out, to get another opinion on her leg before making a decision. And if she refused the dinners, then he'd say, nothing more. Mr. Kane respected people's choices. With that, James rose, smoothly buttoning his suit jacket. He left her with a final thought, that this was an opportunity to transform her life, to end the pain, to walk without a limp, to be free from stares, and to stop worrying about her leg failing completely, all for a few hours of conversation with a man who sought only her honest company. He left the cards and departed. Lena just sat, staring at them for 20 minutes. Dr. Sarah Chen, and the promise of walking again, all for weekly dinners with a mob boss. The idea was crazy, reckless, and likely a setup. But later that night, in her tiny apartment, with her leg throbbing through the painkillers, the offer echoed in her mind. The thought of walking without pain, of not needing to plan every step, of maybe having a semblance of a normal life. At 2 a.m., she dialed the number. A calm, professional receptionist answered immediately, unfazed by the late hour. Doctor? Chen's office, she said. I'm Lena Hayes. I believe I have an appointment. The receptionist confirmed, yes, Miss Hayes, for 10 a.m. tomorrow, a 2-hour consultation. She asked if Lena needed directions. Lena hesitated. I haven't actually confirmed. The receptionist replied warmly that Mr. Kane was certain she would call. So, shall we expect you at 10? Lena knew she should. Refuse? Just hang up. But she heard herself agree. Yes, 10 a.m. Excellent, the receptionist said before the line went dead. Lena lay in the darkness, staring up, wondering what she had just done. Dr. Chen's office was in a section of the city Lena never went to, a place of gleaming towers and designer-clad people, where poverty was an architectural impossibility. The medical center was on the top 3 floors of a skyscraper, with a waiting room like a 5-star hotel. Lena almost left, but the receptionist saw her. Then Dr. Chen appeared, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and an air of complete competence. She introduced herself and led Lena back. The examination was exhaustive, involving X-rays, an MRI, and detailed questions about the accident, her pain, and her daily struggles. Dr. Chen listened intently, her follow-up questions showing she genuinely understood. Afterward, she reviewed the scans on her tablet. Your first surgeons did a decent job, she said, considering what they had to work with. They saved the leg and got you walking, which is commendable. But they only stabilized you. They didn't heal you. Dr. Chen pointed out areas on the scan, showing thick scar tissue and poorly positioned pins. And this nerve damage, it was never properly addressed. She asked if it could be fixed. Dr. Chen looked her straight in the eye. I believe so. It would involve 3 surgeries over 18 months, with intense physical therapy in between. She warned it would be a painful, difficult recovery, but if Lena was committed to the work, she could regain 90, maybe 95% function. 90%. For 4 years, Lena thought 50% was her best-case scenario. When she asked about the cost, the number Dr. Chen gave was staggering, well into 6 figures, maybe more. Dr. Chen explained that Mr. Kane would cover everything, from the surgeries to the aftercare. Lena wouldn't owe a dime. For what in return? That, Dr. Chen said, was between Lena and him. Her face remained neutral, but she did add that she'd worked with Mr. Kane's people before, helping others he'd funded who couldn't afford treatment. And, she said, he had never asked for anything improper. To your knowledge, Lena pressed. Doctor. Chen stated firmly. I'm a mandatory reporter. If I suspected anything coercive or illegal, I would have to report it. I never have. That should mean something. Lena left the gleaming office with a folder and a mind racing with turmoil. She walked for hours, her leg aching, weighing the choice. 90%. No pain, no limp, no more pity. The price was dinner with Victor Kane once a week. It was a mad bargain. But it was also mad to spend the rest of... I remember the day it all started, the moment the air in the diner shifted. Lena was already running on fumes, her limp more pronounced than ever, the pain etched on her face. Then he walked in. James Carter. We all knew who he worked for. That night, after her shift, I heard her on the phone in the back, her voice tight. I only caught bits, something about a real reason and a Friday night. When she hung up, she just stood there, staring out the window like she was looking at a ghost. I should have asked if she was okay, but I didn't. I just clocked out. Fear makes you a coward. I saw her get ready for that first dinner, pulling out that one simple black dress she saved for interviews and funerals. It felt like both. The car that came for her at 7 sharp was like something out of a movie, silent and dark, swallowing her whole. I watched from my window until it was gone, a knot of guilt tightening in my stomach. I knew she was in trouble, the kind you don't walk away from. I couldn't get the image of that car out of my head. It was more than just a ride. It was a border crossing into another world. I watched her hesitate on the sidewalk, her leg clearly aching after a double shift we had to cover because someone else bailed. The driver just stood there, a statue in a suit, his patience a threat. When he spoke her name, his voice was quiet, but it carried. She folded. I imagined the inside smelling of old leather and power, the kind of quiet that makes you feel loud and clumsy. It was a world so far from our sticky tables and the smell of burnt coffee, it might as well have been another planet. I thought about how out of place she must have felt, how every scuff on her worn-out shoes must have screamed that she didn't belong. They drove off towards the part of town we only ever saw on the news, where the gates are high and the secrets are buried deep. I pictured her heading into some fancy, soulless place with no sign on the door, a place where people like us were invisible. She was different when she came in for her shift the next day. Quieter. It was like she'd left a piece of herself in that private room I imagined for her. The rest of us were yelling orders, complaining about tips, but Lena moved like she was underwater, her eyes distant. I saw men in expensive suits that day, men who looked like they belonged in that other world, and I wondered if she even noticed them anymore. I could tell she hadn't just had dinner. She'd been shown a world where power made the rules, and it had shaken her. I tried asking her if the new medication was helping her leg, just a simple question, but she looked right through me. It was like she was surrounded by glass, and I couldn't get through. He hadn't just paid for a doctor, he'd bought her silence too. And I stood by, a silent partner to her isolation, wiping down counters and pretending not to see. I started to see the conflict raging inside her. She needed the help, the surgery that would let her walk without wincing, but the cost was way more than money. She started gripping the edge of the counter sometimes, her knuckles white, like she was holding on for dear life. "What do you really want from me?" I heard her mutter under her breath one afternoon when she thought no one was listening. It chilled me to the bone. I realized this wasn't a simple transaction. He was feeding on her goodness, on the part of her that would shield a coworker without a second thought. He was taking the most decent thing about her and twisting it into a spectacle for his own amusement. That quiet desperation I'd always seen in her eyes was curdling into something harder. She was a good person caught in a predator's game. And the worst part was, I was just watching from the sidelines, too scared to even offer a kind word. I know what men like Victor Kane do. They don't make investments unless the return is guaranteed. Watching Lena day after day, I saw his investment taking hold. She started looking over her shoulder more. The easy smile she used to have for our regulars was gone, replaced by a tight, careful mask. He wasn't just learning about her. He was dissecting her, studying her like some rare specimen. He knew about her aunt, about her helping Emma, about the pain she never spoke of. He knew because he'd made it his business to own every part of her story. It wasn't fascination, it was control. And as I saw her spirit slowly being chipped away, replaced by a hollow-eyed weariness, I finally understood. My silence wasn't keeping me safe, it was making me complicit. I was letting fear dictate my choices, just like everyone else in his world. It was the look on her face after a Tuesday night dinner that finally broke me. She looked shattered, like she'd seen the ugly truth of his world and couldn't unsee it. He told her about his past, tried to draw a line between his violence and her sacrifice, and the twisted logic of it was eating her alive. I thought of my own dad, worked to the bone for a company that threw him away without a thought. I understood the anger, the hunger for power, but I also knew it was a poison. That night, I wrote a quick note. I found her locker, my heart pounding, and slipped it inside with my spare apartment key. It just said, "If you ever need to disappear, no questions asked." It was a small thing, maybe a foolish one, but it was the only thing I could think of to fight back against the gray, suffocating world he was pulling her into. It was my way of finally saying, "You have a choice. You are not alone." Her life broken if she had a choice. She took the deal. Her first dinner with Victor Kane was at a restaurant where the water glasses cost more than her rent. He was older than she expected, with eyes that missed nothing. He wasn't what she pictured. He wasn't charming. He was composed, with an unnerving stillness. He spoke plainly about his world. "I don't apologize for what I am," he told her. "I manage it." He leaned forward, his voice gaining an edge. "Without men like me, you get chaos. You get worse men. I have standards. With me, people know the rules. Rules like threatening a 19-year-old girl." For the first time, he seemed almost sheepish. "A negotiation tactic," he said. "I never would have hurt her." "How could I know that?" "You couldn't. That was the purpose." He sighed, a surprisingly human gesture. "I needed her father to understand the stakes. But you were right. It was harsh. So I paid his debt. Because I collapsed? No. Because you showed me something I had forgotten." His gaze was sharp. True courage. A selfless act without any thought of reward. It was a reminder that not everyone operates on the same dark playing field I do. The main course was served by a waiter who moved like a ghost. "Tell me about your accident," Victor said. Lena stiffened. "Why?" "Because I need to understand. Your leg is part of your story, and I am trying to understand you." She knew she shouldn't reveal anything vulnerable, but his direct, genuine interest disarmed her. "I was 20. I was working 2 jobs, saving for nursing school. It was 3 in the morning, driving home from my warehouse shift, when a drunk driver blew through a red light at Madison and 7th. The memory still felt sharp, a phantom crash in her mind. I walked over to her as she was tying her apron. "Lena," I started, my voice shaky. "I talked to Sal." She looked up, confused. "About what?" I took a deep breath. "About you. If you take whatever this offer is, if you need to be gone for a while, your job will be here when you get back. We'll cover your shifts. Her eyes widened. And I pulled a crumpled envelope from my pocket. It's not much, but all of us, we chipped in for whatever you need, so you don't have to worry. It was maybe $200, nothing compared to Kane's money, but it wasn't his money, it was ours. She stared at the envelope, then at me, her eyes filling with tears. Marcus, why? Because you stood up for Emma when no one else would, I said, the words feeling heavy and true. Because you shouldn't have to do everything alone. It wasn't much, just a small promise that we were behind her. But as she took the envelope, a tiny smile broke through her fear. It was my turn to finally do something, to not be a silent witness anymore. It was a small act, I know, but for the first time since that night, I felt a flicker of hope. I remember that first night, the way Mr. Kane's face was a stone mask. He talked about having more money than God, and her having something he couldn't buy. Authenticity, he called it. I heard it all from the driver's seat, feeling like a ghost. He wanted to rent her courage, her goodness, once a week. My hands tightened on the wheel. At the door, he gave her his private number, a key to a world she should never have unlocked. Don't take it, I wanted to scream. I've seen what this world does to good people. But she did. Driving her home, the city felt darker, like a trap closing around her. I opened her door, the perfect silent machine. I should have said nothing, but the words slipped out, a warning she wouldn't understand. I told her Mr. Kane never does things like this, that she had to be special. I just didn't say that being special to him was the most dangerous thing you could be. That night, I couldn't sleep. My silence felt like a betrayal, the first of many. I knew I was watching the beginning of a tragedy, and I was paid to make sure it had a smooth ride. The next 2 weeks, I was the ferryman. I drove her to doctor's appointments, watched her friend Emma hug her with tearful gratitude. I heard Lena try to explain Mr. Kane as just some strange, helpful man. A lie she told herself, a lie I helped maintain with every silent trip. We never spoke, not really. During their Friday dinners, I'd wait outside the private room, catching fragments of conversation. Her terror about the surgery, his absolute terrifying certainty that his money could fix anything. He saw her as a project, a puzzle. I saw her as a woman walking into a storm she couldn't see. He asked her why it mattered so much to him. I leaned closer to the door, needing to understand. He said he saw truth in her eyes when she fell, and that it haunted him, a haunting that cost a fortune. I knew then that my silence was a bigger crime than I could have imagined. This wasn't business for him. It was something else, something far more complicated and deadly. I remember the first time I really understood her pain. It wasn't one big moment, just the 1,000 little ways she'd try to hide a wince while carrying a heavy tray. I promised myself I'd cover her shifts if she ever asked, but she never did. Then one night, she told me about this deal, this man who was going to pay for a surgery that sounded like science fiction. I saw the desperation in her eyes, and a cold dread settled in my gut. That Tuesday she was gone, the diner felt hollow. I kept thinking about her in some fancy hospital, all alone. I should have said something, warned her that nothing from a man like that ever comes free. But I just wiped down the counter and stayed quiet. I remember thinking she was brave. I was a coward. I watched her go into the lion's den and didn't even raise my voice. When she came back, it was like watching a flower bloom in slow motion. First the crutches, then the cane, then just that slight limp she was so proud of. She never talked much about him, just the therapy. But I saw the fancy cars that would drop her off a block away sometimes, blending into the shadows. I knew he was still there, a ghost in her new life. I'd see her staring out the window, looking tired in a way that had nothing to do with work. I wanted to ask if she was okay, if she was safe. But the words always got stuck in my throat. What could I do? A guy who slings hash for a living against the city's biggest nightmare? So I just made sure her coffee was always fresh and hoped that was enough. It wasn't, not even close. Not even. For a few weeks, I almost let myself believe it was a happy ending. Recovery was tough, but Lena was tougher. The day she walked a full shift without the cane, we all cheered. She had this light in her eyes I hadn't seen in years. It felt real. It felt earned. She told me about the physical therapy, how it was agony but worth it. She even joked about it. But I knew guys like Victor Kane don't just hand out miracles, they trade them. And I watched her, so happy in her small victory, and felt a pit in my stomach because I knew the bill was coming due. It should have been a celebration. Instead, it felt like the quiet before a storm. And I was just standing there, watching the clouds roll in, pretending I couldn't feel the air change. Then the whispers began. At first, it was just the regulars looking at her a little too long. Then new faces started showing up, men who didn't look like they were here for the $2 coffee. They'd sit in a corner booth and just watch her. The chatter would die down whenever she walked past. I saw the light in her eyes start to flicker out, replaced by the old fear she used to have about dropping a plate. Only this was worse. This was a fear you couldn't just sweep up. The diner, our little worn-down sanctuary, started to feel like a cage, and I was one of the keepers, just by saying nothing. I saw the pride in her walk turn into caution. I saw her look over her shoulder, and I knew my silence was making me a liar. He was keeping her, they'd say in hushed tones when she was in the back, that the surgery was just a down payment. I tried to ignore it, but the talk got uglier. Tonight, I saw her hands tremble after she looked at a text. That was it. I couldn't be a spectator anymore. I pulled her aside near the coffee station, the smell of burnt grounds thick in the air. My voice was low when I told her what people were saying, how they saw her as his property. I saw the fight in her eyes waver. It wasn't much, but as she walked away, I tucked a folded piece of paper into her apron pocket. It was the bus schedule out of the city, and a phone number for a cousin of mine 3 states away. It was a coward's move, maybe. But it was the first honest thing I'd done for her in months. A tiny key, for a cage I'd watched being built. She finally said it one night, her voice tight, that people thought she was his mistress. Mr. Kane didn't even blink, just said he knew and didn't care. I could see the panic in her eyes in the rearview mirror. This world has rules, and she was breaking them without even knowing it. She tried to explain that reputation mattered, that his shadow was swallowing her whole. He told her to walk away, a cold offer I knew he prayed she wouldn't take. She couldn't, of course. She was already in too deep. She wanted the impossible, the prize without the price. It doesn't work that way. Never. Then she mentioned the text message, the one that said she was being watched. I felt the air in the car turn to ice. In that moment, the game changed. I saw it on Mr. Kane's face. The cool facade cracked. The casual demeanor was gone, replaced by the predator I knew so well. He asked to see the text. She'd deleted it. 3 p.m., she said. I watched him type on his phone, a command that would send men like me into motion. His questions were sharp, precise. Had she been followed? Had she noticed anything out of place? I had. I had seen the gray sedan twice that week. My job was to report to him, not to her. Another layer of guilt settled on me. He told her she was his weakness. He said it, and the word hung in the car all the way home, a promise of violence. She hadn't asked for any of it, but that didn't matter. He was assigning a security detail, men who would shadow her life. She tried to refuse. He gave her an ultimatum: accept the protection or it all ends. There was no choice. I knew what I had become. Not just a driver, a keeper, a warden in a gilded cage. And I just kept driving, my silence, my consent. I remember the first time I knew, really knew, that Lena was in trouble. It wasn't the fancy car or the dangerous man who sat in her section. It started with James, his regular driver, suddenly gone. This new guy had eyes like a hawk, darting to the mirror, checking for anyone following them. When he walked her all the way to her apartment door, my gut clenched. I saw it from the diner window. A simple act, but it screamed danger. Later, I saw the car. A plain sedan, parked a ways down the block, with two guys inside pretending to be bored. But I've been in this neighborhood long enough to know watchers when I see them. They were good, almost invisible. When Lena came in for her shift, her face was tight with a fear she was trying to hide. "You've got shadows," I said, trying to sound casual as I topped off the sugars. Her quiet, "I know," was worse than a scream. For a week, they were just there, a silent promise of violence. Lena moved like a ghost, starting at every sound. Then Friday rolled around again, another dinner with him. Victor Kane. He looked like death walking, all sharp edges and exhaustion. They sat in that booth for an hour, the food untouched, the silence between them so thick I could feel it from behind the counter. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I didn't need to. I saw it in the way she finally broke, her hands twisting in her lap. I saw it in the way he leaned forward, his face a grim mask. He spoke for a long time, his voice low and intense. Whatever he told her, it stripped the last bit of color from her face. I saw the words weakness and vulnerability on his lips, and I knew this was about more than just dinner. This was about his world, a place where kindness gets you killed. I watched her, hoping she'd get up and walk away, leave him in his darkness right there in that booth. From the look on his face, he was giving her the out, the smart play. But I knew Lena. She had a bigger heart than anyone I'd ever met. She wouldn't run, not if she thought he was in trouble because of her. And that's what scared me most. I saw his whole demeanor change when she stayed. A flicker of something I couldn't name, relief, maybe even gratitude. He said something that sounded like he felt like a person with her. That's the hook, I thought. That's how he keeps her. He makes her feel important, necessary. She should have run. I should have locked the door behind her and told her never to come back. But I just stood there, polishing a clean glass, a silent coward. I remember the first time I saw his car, a sleek black thing that didn't belong in our diner's gravel lot. The way he looked at Lena, like she was the only person in the world, it was different. I should have known then. But it's the night of the incident that I can't shake. That Tuesday. I remember it because Emma called out sick, and Lena, bless her heart, offered to stay and close up. I was tired, my feet were killing me, and I just wanted to go home. I left her wiping down the last of the vinyl booths around 1 in the morning, promising to see her tomorrow. The alley door clicked shut behind me, and I never looked back. That's the part that eats me alive. I knew that backlight was busted. I knew how dark it got back there. But I left her anyway. I was halfway home before I even remembered. By then, it was already too late. I heard her turn down my offer to walk out with her, saying her ride was watching the front. But plans change. I should have insisted. That's the thought that haunts my sleep. The next morning, the diner was crawling with whispers. Mr. Henderson, our manager, told me the police found blood in the alley. My stomach dropped. I pictured Lena, with that leg of hers that was just getting better, trying to move fast on that broken pavement. The rumors were ugly, that it was about her rich boyfriend, that she was caught in his mess. I'd seen him, and I knew he was powerful, but I guess I never thought his world would bleed into ours like that. I imagined her scream, the tearing pain in her leg I knew she'd just spent months healing from. The thought of some brute with stale beer on his breath putting his hands on her, hitting her, it made me physically sick. It didn't matter what kind of man Victor Kane was. What mattered was that Lena was hurt, and I was safe in my bed when it happened. I could have been there. That's a heavy weight to carry. I didn't see her for days. The police tape was gone, but the alley felt different, stained. I couldn't stop thinking about what she must have gone through. Did she have her phone? Did she try to call for help? I imagined her, cornered and terrified, being forced to make a call, to set a trap for the one person who probably ever showed her a bit of kindness. The whispers turned to stories of a shootout, of bodies being found. It felt like something out of a movie, not something that happens behind a 24-hour diner. They used her like bait. The idea of her tied to a pipe in the cold dark, watching him walk into that ambush for her. It's a horror I can't unimagine. 20 minutes must have felt like an eternity, waiting for the violence you know is coming. When I saw Victor Kane again, my heart nearly stopped. He walked right into the diner a week later, calm as you please, and his presence silenced the entire room. He didn't come to eat. He came for Mr. Henderson. I heard him say, his voice low and cold, that Lena would not be losing her job over this. Mr. Henderson just wiped sweat from his forehead and nodded. Seeing him then, I could easily picture him in that alley, unafraid of being outnumbered. I understood that he was a dangerous man, but for the first time, I was glad that danger was on Lena's side. They said his men just appeared out of the shadows, that the whole thing was over in seconds. Fast and brutal, they said. All of that, right behind the place where I pour coffee every day. Lena came back, but she wasn't the same. She was quieter. Her limp was more pronounced, and the bandages on her wrists told a story she never would. She looked like a bird with a broken wing. Victor would pick her up in a car that purred like a panther, lifting her into the seat like she might shatter. I saw them in the parking lot once. She was crying, whispering how sorry she was, and he just held her, his jaw tight. "This is my fault," I heard him say, his voice thick with a rage she couldn't see. He blamed himself, but I knew my share of the blame too. He showed her something on his phone one evening, his face grim. He was making choices for her, laying out a future she never asked for, and she just stood there looking defeated. That's when the bodyguards started. Big men in dark suits, sitting in a black sedan across the street, watching her every move. She wasn't just Lena anymore. She was a jewel to be guarded, a prisoner of his protection. She lost what little freedom she had. It was seeing her like that. A week later, sitting alone in the passenger seat of his car, while he ran an errand, that finally broke me. She looked so trapped, so isolated behind all that polished glass. The guilt I'd been carrying finally pushed me to do something. Anything. I grabbed a coffee mug, filled it, and walked right out of the diner. I ignored the guard who stiffened as I approached. I just knocked gently on her window. When she looked up, startled, I held up the mug and smiled the best I could. A real smile, the first one I'd seen on her face in weeks, bloomed in return. She nodded. It was a small thing, a cup of coffee. But it was my way of telling her she wasn't completely alone. A way to finally break the silence was worse than losing her life. I didn't know where she'd gone, only that she was gone. One day she was here, a shadow of herself. And the next, she just didn't show up for her shift. No call, no text. Her phone went straight to voicemail. For 3 days, my heart was in my throat. I pictured her in an alley, or worse. I felt the guilt eating at me, the bitter taste of all the things I hadn't said, hadn't done. Then, a call from a blocked number. It was her. Her voice was thin, distant. "I'm safe, Marcus. I just needed to get away for a bit." It was a lie, we both knew it. She was in a gilded cage somewhere, a safe house that was anything but safe for her soul. I wanted to scream at her to come home, to let me help her. But what could I do against a man like Victor Kane? So I just said, "Okay, kid, just be careful." The words felt like ashes in my mouth. For 2 weeks, the diner was quiet. Too quiet. I'd look at her empty station and feel that suffocating regret all over again. I knew she was trapped somewhere, staring out a window, her world shrinking until it was just four walls and the fear of what was outside them. She was a prisoner, paying the price for his war. And I was just the guy who poured the coffee, who saw it all happening and chose to look away. I saw him walk into that alley for her, a man ready to die. The thought haunted my days. On the 15th day of her absence, I saw the news. A late-night report about a gang-related incident on the east side. A man named Marcus Vulov, a known crime figure, found dead. It wasn't a question of who did it. Everyone knew it had Victor Kane's signature all over it. My blood ran cold. Lena was tied to this now, tangled up in a murder. I imagined her, wherever she was, hearing the news. Would she feel relief? Or would she feel the weight of that man's death settling on her own shoulders? I knew it would be the latter. That's who she was. She couldn't see a stray dog without trying to help it. How could she live with being the reason a man was killed, no matter how bad he was? I knew this would break something inside her. The violence wasn't just around her anymore. She was the cause of it. When he'd told her what he had to do, had he used those words? Had he told her he was going to remove him from the equation? The coldness of it all made me sick. I kept thinking of the police, but the idea was a joke. In this city, men like Kane and Vulov owned the police. There was no other way in their world, only blood. And now Lena's hands were stained with it, all because she'd been kind. The table, his hand covering hers. A gesture of comfort that was probably a lie. I saw Lena come back a few days later. She didn't call, just walked in during the morning rush, looking like a ghost. She stood by the door, and for a second, I thought she was just going to turn and leave. The argument I'd imagined them having played in my head. Him telling her it wasn't her fault, her insisting that she'd made choices too. Choices to survive. That's what I saw in her eyes now. The grim determination of a survivor, but the light had gone out. She was tired, so tired. Tired of pretending his world had rules she could live by. I watched him leave that night, heading off to kill a man, and then I imagined him coming back, telling her it was over. Just like that, he'd say. So simple for him, so impossible for her. Her life would never be her own again. She'd always be looking over her shoulder, a footnote in his bloody history. He'd promised her safety, but what he'd given her was a life sentence. As she stood there, hesitating in the doorway of the only safe place she had left, I knew what I had to do. All the guilt, all the fear, it all boiled down to this one moment. I couldn't let him be the end of her story. His face was a mix of anger and something like pity. When Lena finally walked over to the counter, her eyes were hollow. "Marcus," she started, her voice cracking. "I can't." I didn't let her finish. I reached under the counter and pulled out the thick envelope I'd been keeping for an emergency. My whole life savings. "Go," I said, my own voice rough with everything I'd kept inside for months. I pushed the envelope into her hands. "There's a bus that leaves for Portland in 1 hour. There's enough in there to start over. New name, new life, anything you want." She stared at me, then at the money, confusion warring with the despair on her face. "I can't take this." "You can, and you will," I insisted, my grip firm on her arm. "I stood by and watched that man pull you into the dark, and I never said a word. I was a coward, Lena. Let me do one brave thing, please. He didn't save you. He put you in the cage. This is you saving yourself." For a long moment, she just stood there, the envelope clutched in her hand. Then, a single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She nodded, a tiny, jerky motion. She turned and walked out the door without another word. I didn't know if she'd make it, but as I watched her disappear down the street, I felt the heavy weight of my silence finally begin to lift. It all started with the sound of breaking glass. I remember freezing, tray in hand, watching those men walk into the diner. I should have screamed, run, done anything, but I was just a kid, paralyzed. Then Lena, my Lena, threw herself in front of me. I carry that moment like a stone in my gut. The guilt never really goes away. It's been weeks, and the whispers around town are a constant reminder that I was the one they were after, that she got hurt because of me. Was he a monster, this Mr. Kane everyone talked about? I didn't know. I only knew his world had crashed into ours, and I couldn't stop it. He came to see me once, told me Lena was safe. He said things about her courage, but his eyes were heavy with something I couldn't name. It felt like he was trying to fix a history I didn't understand, a past that had nothing to do with me but had swallowed my friend whole. And I felt a different kind of shame for not hating him, for just hoping he would keep her safe from the shadows he'd brought with him. Was that what she wanted? I had no idea. All I knew was that I was stuck in the quiet aftermath, wondering if the life she had now, complicated by him and his violence, was any life at all. I closed my eyes, and all I could see was her falling, the aftermath of a chase I never even saw begin. And him, the man who saved her, who paid for everything, was the one who'd ultimately set the whole nightmare in motion. It was a tangled mess, a knot I couldn't begin to unravel from the outside. I just wanted my friend back, wanted things to be simple again. I needed to see her, to know she was okay. I had to do something more than just hope. For what felt like an eternity, I just waited, feeling useless. I heard he took care of the threat, this Volkov person. The news came through the grapevine, clean and cold. It didn't make me feel safer, just emptier, knowing that peace was probably bought with more violence. Lena was still gone, hidden away. On the third day, a sleek black car pulled up outside my apartment. The driver, James, was polite but firm. He said Mr. Kane thought Lena could use a friend. My heart hammered against my ribs the whole drive. The house was a mansion, a palace completely out of place with our lives. When Lena opened the door, I almost cried. For a second, we just stared, two people from a different world standing on the edge of this new, terrifying one. "Emma, what are you?" she started. "Mr. Kane sent for me," I explained, feeling small on the enormous marble steps. "He thought you could use a friendly face." My eyes drank in the place behind her. This gilded cage was where she'd been healing. It should have been a relief, but all I felt was a deeper sense of loss. We sat in a living room bigger than my whole apartment, and I felt so out of place, scared I might smudge the perfect furniture. The quiet between us was heavy with everything unsaid. "Are you okay?" I finally asked, my voice barely a whisper. The whole town was talking, piecing together stories of the attack, of Mr. Kane, of men who disappeared. "It's complicated," she said, and that one phrase seemed to cover everything. I just had to tell her, to get it out. "I wanted to thank you, Lena, for that night, and for whatever this is. I know this is all my fault, because you were protecting me." "This isn't your fault," she insisted, but I couldn't shake the feeling. "Maybe," I said, twisting my fingers in my lap. "But he came to see me. Mr. Kane. Did you know?" The surprise on her face was answer enough. I had to tell her what he said, what I saw in his eyes. He wanted to make sure I was okay, to offer protection. He told me you were the bravest person he'd ever met. I looked right at her, needing her to understand. "He said you changed him, that you made him remember how to care about someone." I took a breath. "He also said he'd never forgive himself if you got hurt because of him, that he was trying to make it right, but he didn't know if you could ever trust him again." I leaned in, my own fear melting away in the face of her pain. "What happened, Lena? What did he do that was so bad?" And so she told me. About the Friday dinners, the surgery that let her walk again, and the awful truth about her brother Daniel, connecting her to Mr. Kane in a way that felt like a curse. She laid out the impossible choice before her: walk away to safety or stay with a man whose world was a constant storm. When she accidentally used the word loving, I couldn't let it go. "You love him?" I asked gently. The conflict on her face was agonizing. "How can I?" she whispered. He's a killer." "But he also saved you," I reminded her. "He gave you your life back." My next words felt bigger than me, like they were coming from somewhere wiser. "People aren't just one thing, Lena. Maybe he's a monster, but maybe he's also a man trying to be better because he met you." "That's too much pressure," she sighed. "Love usually is," I answered. I stayed for 3 hours. When I left, the air felt a little clearer, like she could finally breathe again. I walked away from that palace feeling like I'd finally done something, not just watched from the sidelines. I hadn't fixed anything, but I had shown up. I had held my friend's hand through the darkness. That night, I watched the rain fall, softer this time, and I prayed she'd find her way. I thought about her and Mr. Kane, two broken people trying to find a whole life together. I worried about the choices she was making, about a future tangled up with his, but I also felt a flicker of hope. She was a fighter. Whatever she decided, it would be her choice, made with open eyes. The next morning, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Lena. It just said, "Thank you. I think we're going to be okay." And for the first time since I saw that glass shatter, I felt the stone in my gut get a little bit lighter. I hadn't saved her, not like she saved me. But I had been there. I had spoken up. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. He said it was never about guilt. Meeting her, he explained, was about seeing someone act with courage, not calculation. Finding out about Daniel was just fate tying a knot that was already there. I listened from the driver's seat, the rain on the windshield hiding my reflection. Then she asked the question that mattered. What now? Vulov was gone. The immediate threat was over. He left the choice to her. Go back to her old life, protected from afar, or stay. Stay and face the danger that would always be attached to his name. My own heart was pounding. I had watched him for years, a machine of ambition and control. But as he asked her to stay, I heard something I'd never heard before in his voice. He turned to her, and I could see them through the restaurant window, his face stripped of all its armor. He confessed that he'd fallen in love with her. The words were a bigger risk than any gunfight. She walked toward him, her new strength holding her steady. And I hoped for the first time that my silence hadn't doomed them. I remember the first day like it was a shift I'd never clock out of. She was a heap on the floor of the boss's office, and the look on his face wasn't one I'd ever seen before. It wasn't business. It was something raw, something that made my stomach tighten. I should have known then. We all should have. I spent weeks standing guard outside rooms where her quiet voice and his low rumble were the only sounds, feeling the guilt of my silence grow heavier. I was just a ghost in the hall, a witness to the walls he'd built for years starting to crumble. I'd see him watching her, and I knew we were guarding a man who was losing a war with himself. I saw her hand touch his face one evening, a simple gesture that seemed to carry the weight of everything. I just stood my post, a silent accomplice to a coming storm. My job was to protect him from the world, but I couldn't do a thing to protect him from her. And maybe that's what I regret the most, not realizing sooner that she was the one thing he didn't need protection from. He took her to the penthouse that night. None of us had ever seen him bring anyone there. That place was his fortress, not his home. I watched the security feed, saw her take in the books, the telescope pointed at a sky you couldn't even see. It felt like watching something I had no right to see. He was showing her the man he was when no one was looking, and I felt a pang of guilt, knowing that this version of the boss was a vulnerability we couldn't defend. They talked for hours. I saw him smile, a real smile, not the sharp, cold thing he gave the world. And I thought, this is how it ends. This is the weakness they'll use to tear him down. I watched him pull back to look at her, a question in his eyes, and her answer was a quiet nod. My regret was a cold stone in my gut. I was watching him choose this path, and all I could do was stand by and prepare for the inevitable bloodshed it would bring. The boss was trying to build something better, trying to wash the blood off the money, and then she fell into his life. He told her he was tired of building kingdoms on graves, that he wanted something real. I heard it over the comms, a late-night confession I wasn't meant to hear. Then, 3 days later, James brought the storm to our door. One of Volkov's guys had survived and was running his mouth, painting the boss as a man compromised by a woman. I stood by the door as James laid it out, the partners questioning his judgment, using that word, soft. I watched the boss's face turn to stone. It was the face I knew, the one that gave the orders. He was trying to protect her, but I could feel the empire he'd built over 10 years start to shake. My own silence felt like a betrayal, watching the gears of our world grind forward, knowing she was about to be caught in them. His expression went hard as ice. He told James to set the meeting, declaring that she was staying with him, non-negotiable. The air went thick with what was coming. I saw the brief peace she'd brought him shatter into 1,000 pieces. "This is what it costs," he told her. And I saw her walk right up to him, not a trace of fear in her eyes. "I'm not running," she said. I was terrified for her, for him. "I'm done letting fear decide," she told him. And then she kissed him. It was the first time I'd seen her make the first move, and in that moment, I knew I'd been wrong about her. She wasn't his weakness, she was his reason. "I love you," she said, and the words didn't sound fragile at all. They sounded like a declaration of war. I held my position, the guilt of my misjudgment warring with a new, unfamiliar flicker of hope for them both. "I learned from the best," she told him, and I saw a ghost of a smile on his face. He was proud. We got to the warehouse an hour early. I was on the sweep team, clearing corners, checking sight lines. It was cold, sterile, a place for bad things to happen. Then the boss took his position in the center of the floor, and she stood right there with him. It wasn't the smart play. It was a statement. I watched the partners arrive. Clav, Torres, Chen, men who carved up the city between them. I knew their security teams, knew which ones were jumpy, which were professionals. They walked in like kings surveying their territory, their eyes landing on the boss, and then on her. My job was to watch for threats, but for the first time, it felt like the biggest threat wasn't a bullet, but the quiet woman standing beside the most powerful man in the city. "This is the woman who started a war," Clav said, his voice like gravel. The disrespect was a physical blow in the room. The boss corrected him, his tone pure steel, but Torres just laughed. He called it emotion, called it sloppy. My hand rested on my sidearm, a nervous habit. Chen called her a liability. The tension was a living thing. And then she spoke. She told them to ask her directly, and the sheer force of her nerve silenced 3 of the most dangerous men I'd ever known. They stared at her, and I saw one of Clav's men shift his weight, a subtle, predatory move in his peripheral vision. Before I even thought about it, I took half a step forward, my posture changing from passive guard to active threat. It was a small thing, a message only another professional would read, but it was clear. She's one of ours. It was the first choice I'd made all week, a quiet act of loyalty that finally broke my silence. She called him her conscience, the reason he hadn't become a monster like Vulov. She spoke to Torres and Chenwei with a strength that silenced the entire warehouse. Her words were a shield, defending not just him, but the idea that mercy wasn't a flaw. Then his voice cut in, cold and absolute, reminding them of the order he'd maintained for a decade. Reminding them that erasing Vulov wasn't weakness, it was a message. But Chenwei wasn't convinced. He pointed at her, calling her the problem, the personal feeling that had clouded a business decision. He questioned his judgment. Mr. Kane answered that his judgment had never been clearer, that she had changed him from a man of calculation to one of purpose. As he spoke, I saw one of Chenwei's men shift his weight, his hand moving just slightly toward his jacket, a silent threat aimed at her. And in that instant, my years of silence ended. I took 2 steps forward, placing myself between him and her. I said nothing. I just stood there, a driver, a ghost, finally casting a shadow of his own. I remember the first time I saw the change in him. For years, I'd known Mr. Kane as a force of nature, driven by cold calculation and the bottom line. Our world was an empire held together by threads of fear, and I was just one small, silent part of that machine. My loyalty was bought with a paycheck and the quiet terror of what happened to those who weren't loyal. Then she came along. I was in the warehouse that night, standing in the shadows where I belonged, when he laid it all out for them. Lena, he said, had reminded him that there was more than just power, that protecting someone you care about meant more than being seen as untouchable. I saw the look on his face, raw and honest in a way I'd never seen before. He told them he'd taken out Vulov for her and he'd do it again. Not from weakness, he said, but because he finally knew what was worth the fight. He dared any of them to challenge him, right then and there. The air got thick, heavy with the promise of violence I knew all too well. I held my breath, waiting. Then Chenwei stepped up, his eyes sharp. He said Kane had changed, but the question was whether it was for the better. Better, Kane answered, without a flicker of doubt. He told them to ask anyone, to see he'd become fairer, more strategic. He said he hadn't gone soft, just smart. But words were cheap in our world. And Torres was a man who only dealt in proof. I knew what Torres wanted. When he pulled out that tablet, I knew it was a test. I couldn't make out the screen from where I stood, but I saw Mr. Kane's face go rigid. Marcus Chen's operation. His own nephew. I felt a cold knot in my stomach. By the old rules, the kid was a dead man for skimming. This was it, the perfect trap. Spare him, and Kane was weak. Kill him, and the man talking about a new way was a liar. There was no right move. The silence stretched on as Mr. Kane looked at that screen, then back at Chenwei. He asked him what he wanted to do. The question hung in the air, confusing everyone. It was supposed to be Kane's call. He's your blood, your family, he said to Chenwei. I'm asking what you want. He explained that if it were just business, the answer was simple. But it wasn't simple. So what did he truly want? Chenwei was quiet for a long time. I saw the conflict in his eyes. Finally, he admitted he wanted the kid to learn, to be better, but didn't know if it was possible. That's when Mr. Kane laid out the new rules. He handed back the tablet and said to give him a choice. Leave town and start a clean life, or stay and earn back his place. But he made it clear there were no third chances. That was business. Offering a shot at redemption, though, that was family, and valuing both didn't make you weak. I heard Clav laugh, a real one this time. He was right. The Kane I used to know would have just sent me to clean up the mess. I remember the day he first walked in. Before him, Lena was a ghost, held together by sheer will and the worn-out brace on her leg. We'd work side by side, the silence between us filled with the clatter of plates and the ache I saw in her eyes. I never said anything. What could I say? My silence was a heavy blanket I thought was for her comfort, but it was really for my own. Then he appeared, all quiet intensity and expensive shadows. The night she collapsed, I just watched, frozen behind the counter. My inaction felt like a stone in my gut. In the days that followed, the whispers started. About him, about them. I saw the fear in her, but underneath it, a spark I hadn't seen before. I wanted to grab her, to ask her what she was getting into, but I just kept wiping down tables, a spectator to my own friend's terrifying new life. My regret began then, a quiet seed of shame for not being the friend who intervened, but the one who just watched. You look different, I finally said one night, the words feeling clumsy in my mouth. We were restocking the napkins, a simple, familiar task in the middle of her entirely new reality. Her smile was a fragile, beautiful thing, scared, but happier. That's what she told me. The confession hung between us, thick as the smell of stale coffee. How can you be both? I wanted to scream. How can you love someone dangerous and call it happiness? My hands kept moving, a coward's efficiency. I should have told her to run. Instead, I asked if she was scared he would hurt her. Her real fears were so much bigger, a tangled web of him and his world. And still, she was staying. He's worth it, she said, and in that moment, seeing the impossible hope in her eyes, I bit back every warning on my tongue. I let her walk deeper into the storm, and my silence felt like a final, damning consent. I just watched her go, a friend lost to a world I couldn't fight. She told me she was quitting over a shared plate of fries after a shift. She was practically glowing, talking about a foundation, about helping people, about a chance to do the thing she'd always dreamed of before the accident. His money was funding it. His world was giving her back her own. My smile felt plastered on. Every instinct screamed that this was a cage, just a prettier one, that his name on the door would be a target on her back. I wanted to shake her, to remind her where that money came from, the things a man like that has to do. But I saw the light in her face, a light I thought had been extinguished forever. Telling her my fears would have felt like trying to snuff it out myself. So I said I was proud of her. The words felt like ash in my mouth. My silence wasn't just passive anymore. It was an active lie, a sin of omission I'd carry for her. Time passed, and the foundation became a real thing. It wasn't just talk. The proof came when my own brother needed a surgery we could never have afforded. I filled out the paperwork with trembling hands, feeling the dizzying conflict of it all. I was accepting help from the very man I feared for my friend. Lena's name was on the letter that approved the funding. Director. It felt worlds away from the girl who used to limp through her shifts beside me. I was so grateful I could barely breathe, but I was also terrified. Her connection to him was no longer a secret. It was on letterhead. I watched her become more a part of his world, more visible, and I just prayed. My inaction had turned into a desperate hope that I'd been wrong, that this dangerous man could somehow be her salvation. It was a coward's prayer, but it was all I had. At the anniversary party, I felt like an intruder. This was her world now. My brother, healthy and smiling beside me, was a testament to the good she was doing. I saw Lena talking with Dr. Chen, and she looked strong, happy. Then I saw him, Victor, watching her from across the room. The way he looked at her. It wasn't ownership. It was something quieter, deeper. Everything I had feared seemed to melt away, replaced by a simple, humbling truth. I'd been so wrapped up in my own fear, I hadn't truly seen them. My regret was for my lack of faith in her. So I did the one small, brave thing I could. I walked over to him. He turned, his gaze sharp, and for a second, I faltered. "She's the best person I know," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "Please don't ever make me regret being the friend who stood by and did nothing." It was all I had to offer. A final, hopeful plea to the man who held my friend's heart. I watched them from a distance in the months that followed. I never heard their private words, but I saw the results. I'd see him give her a key, a gesture I didn't understand then, but I saw the look on her face. It wasn't the look of a prisoner, it was the look of someone who was free. He was giving her a choice, every single day. And every day, she chose to stay. I'd stand guard outside a restaurant or drive the car, a silent witness to a quiet conversation, a shared smile, and I'd feel this heavy weight in my gut, the weight of all the choices I'd been a part of before her, the choices that didn't involve mercy or second chances. I saw how he looked at her, and I knew he was trying to build something real out of the wreckage of his life. I saw how she looked at him, with a courage that shamed my own silence. They were choosing each other, knowing how easily it could all fall apart. It made me look at my own hands, at the things I'd done for him, for the organization. I had always just followed orders, never running, just standing still in the shadows. But seeing them, I started to wonder if standing still was its own kind of prison. The years passed. The foundation they built became a real force for good. His businesses started shifting, becoming cleaner. I was still there, on the periphery, a ghost from the past he hadn't discarded. I was working security at their wedding, a small affair for only the most trusted. Emma, her friend, stood by her side. James, one of the good ones, stood by his. As they exchanged vows, promising to choose each other no matter what, I realized how wrong I'd been about things. I used to think survival was the only goal, that stories like mine just ended in a back alley or a prison cell. But theirs wasn't an ending. It was a beginning, a testament to the fact that you could be stronger than the things that broke you. That true bravery wasn't about not being afraid. It was about doing the right thing anyway. They were building a legacy, and I was just a relic of the violence he was leaving behind. 5 years after that wedding, I saw the proof of it all. The new foundation building was incredible. I saw Lena in there, watching some kid learn to walk again. She looked whole, powerful. He came up beside her, and the way they fit together, it was so natural. He'd found a different kind of strength, and I was still just a man who knew how to handle a gun. I knew I couldn't run from the life forever. But now, I was running the coffee shop they helped me set up. Metaphorically, of course. My leg was at about 94%, Dr. Chen said, which felt pretty close to perfect. To me, you were always perfect. He'd pull me close, and I knew he meant it. Broken and all. You're a liar, I'd say. Honest, he'd reply. There's a difference. He'd kiss my forehead. Ready for home? Always. We'd walk out together, my steps even and sure, his hand a steady presence on my back. The city was still the city, full of dark corners and people who made bad choices. But we knew how to find the light now. Driving home, I'd sometimes think about that night, collapsing in the diner and whispering those words that started it all. I can't run. I was so wrong. I could run. I could walk. I could stand tall and face down anything, because I'd fought for every inch of that strength. But the most amazing part was that I didn't have to do it alone anymore. I had found someone who would stand with me. Someone who showed me that mercy wasn't weakness. It was a weapon that could turn monsters into men and broken girls into warriors. He had chosen love over power, and it turned out to be the bravest thing he'd ever done. And together, we built something I never could have dreamed of that night. Everything felt like an ending. It was a life worth living, a love worth fighting for. And it was a future that showed me that the hardest stories can have the most beautiful endings. Not because they become easy, but because you earn them, one courageous choice at a time. I was cleaning up one night when two men from the old days came in. Men who still thought fear was the only currency. They didn't recognize me. They talked low, about the foundation, about using one of the patients to get to Cain, to prove he was soft. My hands started shaking. All the old fear came rushing back. But then I looked at the picture of me and him on the counter. I thought about the little girl who took her first steps that afternoon. I thought about courage. I closed up the shop, went to a payphone and made a call. I didn't leave my name. I just said, Warehouse 7, they're using a patient file. It's a trap. Then I hung up. It wasn't much, but it was my choice, and it was enough. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.